525, Chapter 16 of The Tenant of Wildfell Hall. Book talk starts at 6 minutes.
Welcome to Craftlit, the podcast for crafters who love books. My name is Heather Ordover, and I'm podcasting from where the Delaware River meets the Old York Road, New Hope, Pennsylvania. Episode 525, Meet Mr. Borum. This episode of Craftlit is brought to you by its listeners. Many thanks and much gratefulness to all of the listeners who have gone over to patreon.com/craftlit and pledged their support to the show. We couldn't do it without you. Thank you. Well, hello. How are you? I am well, and I come bearing chapter goodies. Ah, yes, today, chapter 16 is our first day back with Maya Daguerre reading, this time, Helen Graham and her diary, which is gonna be so much fun and funny. There are funnies in here. There's also a lot of foreshadowing and a lot of places where I know you are going to hear things and go, oh, hubris much? Because there's a lot of that going on in this chapter. So that's kind of fun to listen for. And I have a slightly updated chart for you of characters and locations because we are adding this week 2 new actual repeating characters, an aunt and an uncle. And we have their home, which is Stanningley, Stanningly. So that's going to be coming at you too. There will be a link to the PDF in the show notes, so you can go to craftlit.com/525 or craftlin.libsyn.com and search for episode 525. So, new chart. One thing to share with you, aside from the fact that at the end of all of the show notes for the last, several episodes, 4 or 5 episodes, I have been placing the links and information that people are sharing at the Tuesday morning and Thursday night from Eastern time standpoint, the Tuesday and Thursday book and What's Keeping You Busy chats. Lots of goodness there, including Maya Daguerre's take on doing a temperature blanket, which I like so much more than the other temperature blankets that I've seen. So if you're curious about that, you can also find that in the show notes. Just scroll down until you see Maya Daguerre's temperature blanket, and that'll be waiting for you. The only other thing I had wanted to share with you is if you have children or if you yourself have a hard time getting rid of things, I am linking out to a Twitter post. And I know everybody always says, oh my gosh, don't read the comments. This is one of those times where I read the comments and I'm so glad I did. Because a guy had posted, I don't know why this popped into my Twitter feed. I mean, I have my theories, but I don't follow this guy, or I didn't. And yet there was this comment from him saying he had just gotten back from seeing a doctor, and the doctor had said, one of the problems with ADD minds is difficulty with object permanence. This is like the problem that infants have. It's why peekaboo works, because when they can't see you, you have now disappeared. And when your face launches back into their vision, you have reappeared. It's magic. How did that happen? You were gone, and now you're back. This is awesome. Well, as the guy posted this thing about object permanence and ADD brains, a conversation began with people saying, wait a minute, explain that more. Or surely that doesn't mean that if we can't see something, we actually think it disappears. And the conversation went on, and if you read through the thread and read all the replies to all of the replies, because there are several threads that kind of branch off from the main thread, all sorts of insights are shared. And all sorts of, oh my God, same, are posted, because evidently this is a problem. Finally, one person said, wait a minute, is this why I can't throw anything out that actually has a good memory attached to it? Because if out of sight, out of mind is actually a thing that happens in my brain, and the only thing that triggers certain memories are visually seeing the thing, the object itself, that carries that memory with it. If I throw that thing out, I throw out that memory because I won't have anything left to trigger that memory. I will effectively be erasing my happy memories. I know, right? It sounds crazy unless this is how your brain works. If this is how your brain works, you just had a light bulb go off. So I am going to start an experiment of, as I'm cleaning through the basement and throwing things out, I am going to take pictures and write little notes about all of the things that I'm letting go of because I don't need the thing anymore, but I don't want to lose the happy memory. And we'll see how it goes. I'm going to just wind up making a database of my life. So I'll let you know. If you have any genius ideas on that front, please feel free to share. 206-350-1642 or email heather@craftlit.com and we will we'll share them with the crew. All right, let's hop to it. Today, chapter 16, Helen Graham's backstory begins. Dun, 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 dun. And we start with a Bible verse. I know you're shocked. Matthew 26:41. This is one of the ones that you've heard. I know you've heard it. Whether you're Christian or not, you've heard it in some form or another, because this is towards the end of Jesus's life, mortal life. He says to Peter, dude. Okay, he didn't actually say dude, except in Lamb by Christopher Moore. Here we go. Peter, Gethsemane, watch and pray that ye enter not into temptation. The spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is weak. See, I told you you'd heard it before in some form or another. So you are going to hear a don't be Peter. Don't be spirit is willing, but flesh is weak. We are going to get a chance to see Helen Graham coming home from her first season in London, where she's been presented to society. You are going to hear some, not all, some of the advice that every 15, 16-year-old girl should listen to. And then they really need to listen to how Helen doesn't listen to the advice. And then you need to have a good long conversation with them about why Helen didn't listen to her aunt's advice and what the possible consequences could be. And that's why you have the 15, 16-year-old girls listen to the rest of the book with you. We find out some other things about Helen, and we find out that she does have an excellent sense of humor. Witness the name of this episode. Meet Mr. Borum. Mr. Borum's name is really spelled Boarham. Mr. Borum. Helen calls him Mr. Borum, and it is spelled in the book Bore space apostrophe EM. This is something that I have seen kids in my classrooms before make jokes out of, and I love it. Helen is just as perfectly teenagery. She's 18 in this chapter. She's just perfectly teenagery, even though this is 150, almost 200 years old. This is the 200th. This year is the 200th anniversary of Anne Bronte, and so yeah, it's like 180 years since she wrote the book, and teenagers haven't changed. I love that. Asperity. This is not a word we use too often. I think we should bring it back. Asperity. It means harshness of tone or manner. People who speak with asperity often get nasty comebacks because who likes being spoken to harshly with a harsh tone or a harsh manner? Mr. Wilmot. Here is something I don't remember learning for Jane Eyre, Charlotte Bronte's book. There was a guy named Wilmot, Wilmot, who was a Restoration-era libertine poet and reprobate. That's the way he's defined. Libertine poet, think Lord Byron, kind of scandalizing, kind of loose with the morals thing, poet. So therefore, Emily and Anne and Charlotte would have read his poetry, and they would be familiar with his life story. Here's where it gets really interesting. He was the second Earl of, wait for it, Rochester. This guy inspired, some people think, Rochester in Jane Eyre. He also is mentioned, they think, by name. Wilmot is a name that shows up in today's chapter. People think that this is a reference back to him, that this is just Anne's way of kind of throwing Charlotte a bone and showing her knowledge of some kind of racy and scandalous history to readers. I don't know if it's true or not, but I could not tell you about the Rochester connection because that's just awesome. So we have one last quotation. This one comes from Midsummer Night's Dream. And Hermia, who is one of the young women who's being pursued by suitors in Midsummer, Theseus has been, messing around with the mortals, which, like Aaron Ziegler talked about, I think it was the last time that he was on one of our group chats. There was a version of Midsummer Night's Dream that he saw, and I wish I could remember which version it was. I'm sure he will be able to remind me, where he said Puck was so well done, played by a woman, so well done, that it was the first time that he kind of grokked the fact that if you are immortal, you will have done and tried everything by now. If you've been immortal for a while, you will have been there, done that with everything, and you would be supremely bored. So messing around with mortals' lives and causing them great pain or joy really would kind of be the only interesting thing left to you, because it would be the only unpredictable thing left to you. So we get gods like Theseus in Midsummer Night's Dream messing around with people's loves lives. Is that the plural of the plural? I'm not going to think about that anymore. The quote, however, is from Theseus talking about Hermia and saying, if she doesn't come around, we are going to witness a woman who, like a cloistered rose, will grow, live, and die in single blessedness, so that she'll have one shot at growing up, living, and dying, being beautiful, being young, and then it's all over anyway. And if you're cloistered, who sees it? You, and that's it. And Hermia's take on the whole thing is fine. I would rather grow, live, and die in single blessedness than be married off to a guy I loathe. Now, this was not a position that was often stated publicly. At the time, it's certainly a position that was involved in women's conversations with each other and in literature that had to do with women, but it didn't really make it out into public. So you wind up with a lot of guys at this time really kind of not getting why a 40-year-old, dour, dull kind of guy with a fortune still might not be a great catch for a young, romantic girl. So you get a little bit of that today as well. To me, there is a lot of Anne's eyes twinkling at us and winking at us in a way that is slightly Jane Austen-y, kind of Elizabeth Bennet-y, that I get a joy and a fun that I certainly never saw in Wuthering Heights, a world where there is no joy, there is no fun. And I can't even remember in Jane Eyre a moment where we came across anything as funny and light as this. And yet, what you are about to hear is, as I said before, the most important conversation a young, in this case, 18-year-old girl at this time in this era could have had with an adult woman who is really, really trying to do well by her. So let's launch in to listening to the fabulous and voice you've known for a while now, Maya Daguerre, read Chapter 16 of The Tenant of Wildfell Hall by Anne Bronte for us. Here we go.
Chapter 16 The Warnings of Experience. June 1st, 1821. We have just returned to Stanningley. That is, we returned some days ago, and I'm not yet settled and feel as if I never should be. We left town sooner than was intended, in consequence of my uncle's indisposition. I wonder what would have been the result if we'd stayed the full time. I'm quite ashamed of my new-sprung distaste for country life. All my former occupations seem so tedious and dull, my former amusements so insipid and unprofitable. I cannot enjoy my music because there's no one to hear it. I cannot enjoy my walks because there's no one to meet. I cannot enjoy my books because they have no power to arrest my attention. My head is so haunted with the recollections of the last few weeks that I cannot attend to them. My drawing suits me best, for I can draw and think at the same time, and if my productions cannot now be seen by anyone but myself and those who do not care about them, they possibly may be hereafter. But then there is one face I am always trying to paint or sketch, and always without success, and that vexes me. As for the owner of that face, I cannot get him out of my mind, and indeed I never try. I wonder whether he ever thinks of me, and I wonder whether I shall ever see him again, and then might follow a train of other wonderments, questions for time and fate to answer, concluding with, supposing all the rest be answered in the affirmative, I wonder whether I shall ever repent it, as my aunt would tell me I should if she knew what I was thinking about. How distinctly I remember our conversation the evening before our departure for town, when we were sitting together over the fire, my uncle having gone to bed with a slight attack of the gout. "Ellen," she said, after a thoughtful silence, "do you ever think about marriage?" "Yes, aunt, often." "And do you ever contemplate the possibility of being married yourself, or engaged before the season is over?" "Sometimes, but I don't think it at all likely that I ever shall." "Why so?" "Because I imagine there must only be a very, very few men in the world that I should like to marry, and of those few it's 10 to 1 I may never be acquainted with one, or if I should, it's 20 to 1 that he may not happen to be single or to take a fancy to me." "That is no argument at all. It may be very true, and I hope it is true, that there are very few men whom you would choose to marry, of yourself. It is not indeed to be supposed that you would wish to marry anyone until you were asked. A girl's affections should never be won unsought. But when they are sought, when the citadel of the heart is fairly besieged, it's apt to surrender sooner than the owner is aware of, and often against her better judgment, and in opposition to all her preconceived ideas of what she could have loved, unless she be extremely careful and discreet. Now I want to warn you, Helen, of these things, and to exhort you to be watchful and circumspect from the very commencement of your career, and not to suffer your heart to be stolen from you by the first foolish or unprincipled person that covets the possession of it. You know, my dear, that you are only just 18. There is plenty of time before you, and neither your uncle or I are in any hurry to get you off our hands, and I may venture to say there will be no lack of suitors, for you can boast a good family, pretty considerable fortune and expectations, and I may as well tell you likewise, for if I don't others will, that you have a fair share of beauty besides, and I hope you may never have cause to regret it." "I hope not, aunt, but why should you fear it?" "Because, my dear, beauty is that quality which next to money is generally the most attractive to the worst kind of men, and therefore it's likely to entail a great deal of trouble on the possessor." "Have you been troubled in that way, aunt?" "No, Helen," she said with reproachful gravity, "but I know many that have, and some, through carelessness, have been wretched victims of deceit, and some through weakness have fallen into snares and temptations terrible to relate." "Well, I shall neither be careless nor weak." "Remember Peter, Helen, don't boast, but watch. Keep a guard over your eyes and ears as the inlets to your heart, and over the lips as the outlet, lest they betray you in a moment of unwariness. Receive coldly and dispassionately every attention until you have ascertained and duly considered the worth of the aspirant. Let your affections be consequent upon approbation alone. First study, then approve, then love. Let your eyes be blind to all external attractions, your ears deaf to all fascinations of flattery and light discourse. These are nothing, and worse than nothing, snares and wiles of the tempter to lure the thoughtless to their own destruction. Principle is the first thing after all, and next to that good sense, respectability, and moderate wealth. If you should marry the handsomest, most accomplished, and superficially agreeable man in the world, you little know of the misery that would overwhelm you, if after all you should find him to be a worthless reprobate, or even an impracticable fool." "But what are all the poor fools and reprobates to do, aunt, if everyone followed your advice? The world would soon come to an end." Never fear, my dear, the male fools and reprobates will never want for partners, while there are so many of the other sex to match them. But do you follow my advice? And this is no subject for jesting, Helen. I'm sorry to see you treat the matter in that light way. Believe me, matrimony is a serious thing. And she spoke it so seriously that one might have fancied she'd known it to her cost. But I asked no more impertinent questions, and merely answered, I know it is, and I know there's truth and sense in what you say. But you need not fear me. Not only would I think it wrong to marry a man that was deficient in sense or in principle, but I should never be tempted to do it, for I could not like him if he were ever so handsome and ever so charming in other respects. I should hate him, despise him, pity him, anything but love him. My affections not only ought to be founded on approbation, but they will and must be so, for without approving I cannot love. It's needless to say I ought to be able to respect and honour the man I marry as well as love him, for I cannot love him without. So set your mind at rest. I hope it may be so, answered she. I know it is so, persisted I. You have not been tried yet, Helen. We can but hope, she said in her cold, cautious way. I was vexed at her incredulity, but I'm not sure her doubts were entirely without sagacity. I fear I found it much easier to remember her advice than to profit by it. Indeed, I've sometimes been led to question the soundness of her doctrines on those subjects. The counsels may be good as far as they go, in the main points at least, but there are some things she has overlooked in her calculations. I wonder if she was ever in love. I commenced my career, or my first campaign, as my uncle calls it, kindling with bright hopes and fancies, chiefly raised by this conversation, and full of confidence in my own discretion. At first I was delighted with the novelty and excitement of our London life, but soon I began to weary of its mingled turbulence and constraint, and sigh for the freshness and freedom of home. My new acquaintances, both male and female, disappointed my expectations, and vexed and depressed me by turns, for I soon grew tired of studying their peculiarities and laughing at their foibles, particularly as I was obliged to keep my criticisms to myself, for my aunt would not hear them, and they, the ladies especially, appeared so provokingly mindless and heartless and artificial. The gentlemen seemed better. Perhaps it was because I knew them less, perhaps because they flattered me. But I did not fall in love with any of them, and if their attentions pleased me one moment, they provoked me the next, because they put me out of humour with myself by revealing my vanity and making me fear I was becoming like some of the ladies I so heartily despised. There was one elderly gentleman that annoyed me very much, a rich old friend of my uncle's, who I believe thought I could not do better than marry him. But besides being old, he was ugly and disagreeable, and wicked, I'm sure, though my aunt scolded me for saying so, but she allowed that he was no saint. And there was another, less hateful, but still more tiresome, because she favoured him, and was always thrusting him upon me, and sounding his praises in my ears. Mr. Boreham by name, Boreham as I preferred spelling it, for a terrible bore he was. I shuddered still at the remembrance of his voice. Drone, drone, drone in my ear, while he sat beside me, prosing away by the half-hour together, and beguiling himself with the notion that he was improving my mind by useful information, or impressing his dogmas on me and reforming my errors of judgment, or perhaps that he was talking down to my level and amusing me with entertaining discourse. Yet he was a decent man enough in the main, I dare say, and if he kept his distance I never would have hated him. As it was almost impossible to help it, for he not only bothered me with the infliction of his own presence, but he kept me from the enjoyment of more agreeable society. One night, however, at a ball, he had been more than usually tormenting, and my patience was quite exhausted. It appeared as if the whole evening was fated to be insupportable. I had had just one dance with an empty-headed coxcomb, and then Mr. Boreham had come upon me and seemed determined to cling to me for the rest of the night. He never danced himself, and there he sat, poking his head in my face and impressing all beholders with the idea that he was a confirmed, acknowledged lover, my aunt looking complacently on all the time and wishing him Godspeed. In vain I attempted to drive him away by giving loose to my exasperated feelings, even to positive rudeness. Nothing could convince him that his presence was disagreeable. Sullen silence was taken for rapt attention and gave him greater room to talk. Sharp answers were received as smart sallies of girlish vivacity that only required an indulgent rebuke, and flat contradictions were but as oil to the flames, calling forth new strains of argument to support his dogmas, and bringing down upon me endless floods of reasoning to overwhelm me with conviction. But there was one present who seemed to have a better appreciation of my frame of mind. A gentleman stood by who had been watching our conference for some time, evidently much amused at my companion's resourceless pertinacity and my manifest annoyance, and laughing to himself at the asperity and uncompromising spirit of my replies. At length, however, he withdrew, and went to the lady of the house, apparently for the purpose of asking an introduction to me. For shortly after they both came up, and she introduced him as Mr. Huntingdon, the son of a late friend of my uncle's. He asked me to dance. I gladly consented, of course, and he was my companion during the remainder of the stay, which was not long, for my aunt, as usual, insisted upon an early departure. I was sorry to go, for I had found my new acquaintance a very lively and entertaining companion. There was a certain graceful ease and freedom about all he said and did that gave a sense of repose and expansion to the mind, after so much constraint and formality I had been doomed to suffer. There might be, it is true, a little too much careful boldness in his manner and address, but I was in so good a humour and so grateful for my late deliverance from Mr. Boreham that it did not anger me. "Well, Helen, how do you like Mr. Boreham now?" said my aunt, as we took our seats in the carriage and drove away. "Worse than ever," I replied. She looked displeased, but said no more on the subject. "Who was the gentleman you danced with last," resumed she, after a pause, "that was so officious in helping you on with your shawl?" "He was not officious at all, aunt. He never attempted to help me until he saw Mr. Boreham coming to do so, and then he stepped laughingly forward and said, 'Come, I'll preserve you from that infliction.'" "Who was it, I ask?" said she, with frigid gravity. "It was Mr. Huntingdon, the son of uncle's old friend." "I've heard your uncle speak of young Mr. Huntingdon. I've heard him say he's a fine lad, that young Huntingdon, but a bit wildish, I fancy. So what have you beware?" "What does a bit wildish mean?" I inquired. "It means destitute of principle and prone to every vice that's common to youth. But I've heard uncle say that he was a sad wild fellow himself when he was young." She sternly shook her head. "He was jesting then, I suppose," said I. "And here he was speaking at random. At least I cannot believe there's any harm in those laughing blue eyes." "False reasoning, Helen," she said with a sigh. "Well, we ought to be charitable, you know, aunt. Besides, I don't think it's false. I am an excellent physiognomist, and I always judge people's character by their looks, not by whether they're handsome or ugly, but by the general cast of their countenance. For instance, I should know by your countenance that you were not a cheerful, sanguine disposition, and I should know by Mr. Wilmot's that he was a worthless old reprobate, and by Mr. Boreham's that he was not an agreeable companion, and by Mr. Huntingdon's that he was neither a fool nor a knave, though possibly neither a sage nor a saint. But that's no matter to me, as I'm not likely to meet him again, unless as an occasional partner in the ballroom." It was not so, however, for I met him again the next morning. He came to call upon my uncle, apologising for not having done so before, by saying he was only lately returned from the Continent and had not heard till the previous night of my uncle's arrival in town. And after that I often met him, sometimes in public, sometimes at home, for he was very assiduous in paying his respects to his old friend, who did not, however, consider himself greatly obliged by the attention. "I wonder what the deuce the lad means by coming so often," he would say. "Can you tell, Helen, eh? He wants none of my company, nor I his, that's certain." "I wish you'd tell him so, then," said my aunt. "Why, what for? If I don't want him, someone else does, mayhap," winking at me. "Besides, he's a pretty tidy fortune, Peggy, you know. Not such a catch as Wilmot, but then Helen won't hear of that match, for somehow these old chaps don't go down with the girls, with all their money and their experience to boot. I'll bet anything she'd rather have this young fellow without a penny than Wilmot with all his house full of gold. Wouldn't you, Nell?" Yes, uncle, but that's not saying much for Mr. Huntington, for I'd rather be an old maid and a pauper than Mrs. Wilmot. And Mrs. Huntington? What would you rather be than Mrs. Huntington, eh? I'll tell you when I've considered the matter. Oh, it needs consideration then. But come now, would you rather be an old maid, let alone the pauper? I can't tell till I'm asked. And I left the room immediately to escape further examination. But 5 minutes after, in looking from my window, I beheld Mr. Boreham coming to the door. I waited nearly half an hour in uncomfortable suspense, expecting every minute to be called, and vainly longing to hear him go. Then footsteps were heard on the stairs, and my aunt entered the room with a solemn countenance, and closed the door behind her. "Here is Mr. Boreham, Helen," said she. "He wishes to see you." "Oh, aunt, can't you tell him I'm indisposed? I'm sure I am, to see him." "Nonsense, my dear, this is no trifling matter. He's come on a very important errand, to ask for your hand in marriage of your uncle and me." "I hope my uncle and you told him it was not in your power to give it. What right had he to ask anyone before me? Helen, what did my uncle say?" "He said he would not interfere in the matter. If you like to accept Mr. Boreham's obliging offer, you—" "Did he say obliging offer?" "No, he said if you'd like to take him you might, and if not you might please yourself." "He said right. And what did you say?" "It's no matter what I said. What will you say? That's the question. He's now waiting to ask you himself, but consider well before you go. And if you intend to refuse him, give me your reasons." "I shall refuse him, of course. But you must tell me how, for I want to be civil and yet decided. When I've got rid of him, I'll give you my reasons afterwards. But stay, Helen, sit down a little and compose yourself. Mr. Boreham's in no particular hurry, for he's little doubt of your acceptance, and I want to speak with you. Tell me, my dear, what are your objections to him? Do you deny that he's an upright, honourable man?" "No." "Do you deny that he is sensible, sober, respectable?" "No, he may be all this, but Helen, how many such men do you expect to meet with in the world? Upright, honourable, sensible, sober, respectable? Is this such an everyday character that you should reject the possessor of such noble qualities without a moment's hesitation? Yes, noble I may call them, for I think of the full meaning of each and how many inestimable virtues they include. And I might add many more to the list. And consider that all this is laid at your feet. It is in your power to secure this inestimable blessing for life. A worthy and excellent husband who loves you tenderly, but not too fondly so as to blind him to your faults, and will be your guide throughout life's pilgrimage and your partner in eternal bliss. Think how—" "But I hate him, aunt," I said, interrupting this unusual flow of eloquence. "Hate him, Helen? Is this a Christian spirit? You hate him, and he so good a man?" "I don't hate him as a man, but as a husband. As a man, I love him so much that I wish him a better wife than I, one as good as himself, or better, if you think that possible, providing she could like him. But I never could, and therefore—" "But why not? What objection do you find?" "Firstly, he is at least 40 years old, considerably more, I should think, and I am but 18. Secondly, he is narrow-minded and bigoted in the extreme. Thirdly, his tastes and feelings are wholly dissimilar to mine. Fourthly, his looks, voice, and manner are particularly displeasing to me. And finally, I have an aversion to his whole person that I can never surmount." "Then you ought to surmount it, and please to compare him for a moment with Mr. Huntington, and, good looks apart, which contribute nothing to the merit of the man, or to the happiness of married life, and which you so often profess to hold in light esteem, tell me which is the better man." "I have no doubt Mr. Huntington is a much better man than you think him. But we're not talking about him now, but about Mr. Boreham. But as I would rather grow, live, and die in single blessedness than be his wife, it is but right that I should tell him so at once, and put him out of suspense. So let me go." "But don't give him a flat denial. He has no idea of such a thing, and it would offend him greatly. Say you have no thoughts of matrimony at present." "But I have thoughts of it." "Or that you desire further acquaintance." "But I don't desire further acquaintance, quite the contrary." And without waiting for further admonitions, I left the room and went to seek Mr. Boreham. He was walking up and down the drawing-room, humming snatches of tunes and nibbling the end of his cane. "My dear young lady," said he, bowing and smirking with great complacency, "I have your kind guardian's permission." "I know, sir," said I, wishing to shorten the scene as much as possible, "and I'm greatly obliged for your preference, but I must beg to decline the honour you wish to confer, for I think we were not made for each other, as you yourself would shortly discover if the experiment were tried." My aunt was right. It was quite evident that he had little doubt of my acceptance, and no idea of positive denial. He was amazed, astounded at such an answer, but too incredulous to be much offended, and after a little humming and hawing he returned to the attack. "I know, my dear, that there exists a considerable disparity between us in years, in temperament, and perhaps some other things, but let me assure you I shall not be severe to mark the faults and foibles of a young and ardent nature such as yours, and while I acknowledge them to myself, and even rebuke them with a father's care, believe me, no youthful lover could be more tenderly indulgent towards the object of his affections than I to you. And, on the other hand, let me hope that my more experienced years and graver habits of reflection will be no disparagement in your eyes, as I shall endeavour to make them all conducive to your happiness. Come now, what do you say? Let us have no young ladies' affectations and caprices, but speak out at once." "I will, but only to repeat what I said before, that I'm certain we were not made for each other." "You really think so?" "I do." "But you don't know me. You wish for a further acquaintance, a longer time to—" "No, I don't. I know you as well as I ever shall, and better than you know me, or you'd never dream of uniting yourself to one so incongruous, so utterly unsuitable to you in every way." "But, my dear young lady, I don't look for perfection. I can excuse—" "Thank you, Mr. Boreham, but I won't trespass upon your goodness. You may save your indulgence and consideration for some more worthy object that won't tax them so heavily." "But let me beg you to consult your aunt. That excellent lady, I'm sure, will—" "I have consulted her, and I know that her wishes coincide with yours. But in such important matters I take the liberty of judging for myself, and no persuasion can alter my inclinations, or induce me to believe that such a step would be conducive to my happiness or yours. And I wonder that a man of your experience and discretion should think of choosing such a wife." "Oh, well," said he, "I have sometimes wondered that myself. I've sometimes said to myself, 'Now, Boreham, what is this you're after? Take care, man, look before you leap. This is a sweet, bewitching creature, but remember the brightest attractions to the lover too often prove the husband's greatest torments.' I assure you my choice has not been made without much reasoning and reflection. The seeming imprudence of the match has cost me many an anxious thought by day and many a sleepless hour by night. But at length I satisfied myself that it was not, in very deed, imprudent. I saw my sweet girl was not without her faults, but of these her youth, I trusted, was not one, but rather an earnest of virtues yet unblown, and a strong ground of presumption that her little defects of temper and errors of judgment, opinion, or manner were not irremediable, but might easily be removed or mitigated by the patient efforts of a watchful and judicious adviser. And where I failed to enlighten and control, I thought I may safely undertake to pardon, for the sake of her many excellencies. Therefore, my dearest girl, since I am satisfied, why should you object? On my account, at least." "But to tell you the truth, Mr. Boreham, it is on my account I principally object. So let us drop the subject." I would have said, for it is worse than useless to pursue it any further, but he so pertinaciously interrupted me with, "But why so? I would love you, cherish you, protect you," etc., etc. I shall not trouble myself to put down all that passed between us. Suffice it to say that I found him very troublesome, and very hard to convince that I really meant what I said, and really was so obstinate and blind to my own interest that there was no shadow of a chance that either he or my aunt would ever be able to overcome my objections. Indeed, I'm not sure that I succeeded after all, though wearied with his so pertinaciously returning to the same point and repeating the same arguments over and over, forcing me to reiterate the same replies, I at length turned short and sharp upon him, and my last words were, "I tell you plainly that it cannot be. No consideration can induce me to marry against my inclinations. I respect you, at least I would respect you if you would behave like a sensible man, but I cannot love you, and I never could, and the more you talk, the further you repel me, so pray don't say any more about it. Whereupon he wished me a good morning, and withdrew, disconcerted and offended, no doubt, but surely it was not my fault.
Okay. I want to start at the very end, and then I'm going to flip back to the beginning of the chapter and work through it. First off, the fact that she ends with, "But surely it wasn't my fault." That is such a Gilbert line. Am I wrong? That's exactly the kind of thing that we've seen Gilbert say over and over and over again. Well, of course, I wasn't that bad. I wasn't as bad as him. It wasn't my fault. And here we have Helen doing the same thing. Admittedly, Helen is 8 years younger at this point than Gilbert is when he was writing his section. But still, it is that young person's tunnel vision of, well, infallibility, really. But also not just their infallibility, but their imperviousness to flaws and mistakes that other people have and mistakes that other people have made. It's not going to happen to me. Famous last words. Hey, watch this. All of that kind of thing is so 18-year-old, 15-year-old, 24-year-old sometimes. So, all right. Knowing that we wind up in a Gilbert-like place, let's go back to the beginning. We learned that Helen Graham is living with her aunt and uncle. We don't know what happened to her family, why she is living with her aunt and uncle, but she doesn't seem unhappy. She seems well cared for and loved. Her uncle is funny. I don't know why this guy is coming around the house. Wink, wink. Say no more, say no more. Her aunt clearly loves her and says something that I don't think we've seen. Holy cow. Actually, no, I'm thinking back now. I don't think we've ever seen a parent say this. She says, "We're not in any hurry to get rid of you. There is no time pressure on you to find a husband." This is the auntie, Mrs. Bennet. Poor Mrs. Bennet, who has to try and marry off 5 girls or watch them all be, old maids, I put in air quotes, or destitute. Aunt here loves Helen, happy to keep her around. She says, "You have a pretty face, you have a good family, and you've got some money. Unfortunately, the money and the pretty are liabilities instead of benefits because they're going to attract the wrong kind of guy." I don't imagine things are all that much different now, not being on the market myself for the last 25 years. I seriously wouldn't know if anything's changed or not. But we have Helen Graham in a good, happy home. And that's awesome. And it's so not anything else written by a Bronte. So yay, that's fun. We get that she was thinking about a face and drawing a face that she couldn't get out of her mind, which we're definitely going to know who that is soon if we haven't already figured it out. There was a moment where it rang all of my, this is going to date me, Reality Bites, the movie, warning bells. If you haven't seen this, it is very dated. It is very dated. Early 90s, Winona Ryder, Ethan Hawke, Ben Stiller, falling in love with the wrong guy, or at least going out with the wrong guy kind of thing. But it reminded me, and I don't remember if this is actually a line in it or just a vibe that I got from the movie, but it's a very easy out for a young person when talking to themselves and sometimes to the adult who's annoying them. This is just proof that I just can't tell if you were ever in love. Nobody's ever felt the way I do. You clearly don't know what it's like to be in love the way I'm in love. And boy, if that isn't a line that should make all the warning bells ring in your head. And I'm not saying for the adults, I'm saying for the young people. If you hear those words coming out of your mouth, smack yourself gently, kindly on your cheek, go look in a mirror and say, "Don't be Helen Graham." And that's not, by the way, that line, "I wonder if you were ever in love like me." That is not just something girls say to themselves. I know guys who've said that too. So smack yourself gently, kindly. Go look in a mirror. Say, "I will not be Helen Graham" 3 times in the mirror. Turn around. And look in the mirror, and suddenly you will be sent back in time to 1821. The "I wonder if she was ever in love" is followed up by the "Don't worry about me. I could never do that. I'd never be that stupid." I loved when the aunt was saying, "Listen, there are fools and reprobates out there, and they're going to try and marry you. So learn how to spot them and run the other way." And Helen's like, but if nobody marries them, then what are the fools and reprobates going to do? The poor fools and reprobates. Nobody's going to love them. Aw, the world must be peopled, quoting Shakespeare again. I also loved that Helen does give us this little hint early on in the chapter where she said, "I found it very odd that it was easier to remember what my aunt said than to follow what my aunt said." And I think this is where you get the "I wish I'd listened to what my mother said." And unlike the Douglas Adams joke, what did she say? "I don't remember, I didn't listen." Instead, it's "I wish I had listened to what my mother said." Oh, what did your mother say? All of this good advice that I heard but didn't follow. I heard but I didn't listen to the meaning and the importance of it. I also loved that she put in the line about when the younger guys were kind of fawning on her and telling her sweet nothings and paying her compliments and stuff. She recognized that she was starting to behave like the insipid, stupid girls who she didn't like very much. She didn't find a whole lot of people in London who she dug and felt like she had anything in common with. Just from her language alone, we can tell the girl's been educated, and she is a thinking, thoughtful, interesting person, and she is an interested person. It's hard to be the smart girl in the room. It's especially hard to be the smart girl in the room if some of the people who aren't as smart as you are the adults in the room. And that's where we get Mr. Wilmot and Mr. Borum. And then we get Mr. Huntingdon. And just so you have it clearly in your head, his name is spelled Hunting, Hunting, Dun, D-O-N. So it's not Huntington like the library, T-O-N, it's D-O-N. So we have Mr. Huntingdon, whose father was friends with her uncle. So he's got a connection to the family. He is not an unknown quantity or quality. His uncle seems to get along with him just fine, although he's like, "I don't know why he's hanging around talking to me. I don't want to talk to him, but maybe you do." Another one of the things that Helen does a really good job at, teenager-y wise, is always having an argument or an answer for her aunt. So every time her aunt comes in with a "really, sweetheart, you should pay attention to this and listen to me," Helen's got an excuse, a response, an answer. She's not really smart-mouthed about it. She's just a very good arguer and a good position taker and a really quick thinker. And you would think this would actually be very helpful for her in the future. So we'll see how that works out for her. I loved her comment to Borum, about Borum talking to her aunt, that of course she loves him. She loves him so much that she wishes him to have a better wife than her. That is just priceless. But we do see some really awful behavior. I mean, not awful behavior, cringy behavior on Mr. Borum's part. "Don't worry, I'll rebuke your faults with a father's care." Dude, I don't want to marry my father. Ew. Ew. First off, rebuke my faults, bite me. And as an 18-year-old. And second off, ew. You're going to marry me to be my dad? That's just creepy. And yes, he is old enough to be her dad. And that's kind of the point. It's creepy. So we have had our introduction to Helen. She is fast. She is funny. She is smart. She is surrounded by love and good family upbringingness. She lives in a nice home. We know that they're not in London because they've gone to London. We don't actually know if she's in Yorkshire growing up. We don't know if Stanningley is in Yorkshire or not. But we do know that she had to travel from the country to London, and that Helen has not been swayed by London's charms, I think is what it comes down to. So we've gotten a lot of information in our first Helen chapter. We are going to get more. There will be more wisdom from the aunt. But I am kind of entirely not joking about how important these chapters between Helen and her aunt are when it comes to young people. Still, I know that COVID has done all sorts of weirdness, but this is why I look at things like Barrett and Browning and how their entire courtship pretty much was done on paper. It's actually really hard to cover up a negative personality if you are writing all day, every day, all the time, and sending love letters back and forth to each other. And so if our new normal is to be physically distanced, you don't want to be socially distanced, you want to be physically distanced. If our whole MO moving forward is that dating is going to be a little different than it's been before, maybe writing to each other, sending notes, it's not such a bad idea. God knows, Andrew and I wrote daily, multiple times daily, on America Online while he was living in New York and I was living in Los Angeles before I moved out to New York City. And we talked about a lot of really important, interesting, challenging, difficult things that might have been hard to talk about in person, face to face, but that we could talk about quite easily in writing back and forth to each other, whether it was in a chat room or an email. So yeah, AOL made my marriage a success. They need that on a bumper sticker or something because they've gone downhill. All right. We do have a couple of emails to share. I put out the call last week for men to let us know what they think about Helen and Gilbert. Larry wrote in. Hi, Larry. Larry wrote in and says, I think Helen should cut Gilbert loose. He's arrogant, makes assumptions instead of communicating, and has a violent streak. But I suppose she won't, and they will live happily ever after. However, he is, or was, the closest thing she had to a friend in the area. He's a decent male in Arthur's life, which is true and very important. And he does have some other fine qualities. So I agree. And it's going to be really interesting to see how things move along from here. And actually, that's it. I thought I had another email, but I just went back through everything and I don't. So you're on your own for another week. Have a great one. Be well. Take care of each other. Make and wear your masks. And I'll talk to you soon. Take care. Have a great one. Bye. A big thanks to all the Craftlit listeners who support the show by being a premium audio member via craftlit.com/premium or via patreon.com/craftlit. Your support for the show is what's kept us going since 2006. If you feel like getting free audio pretty much every week, please consider supporting the show by heading over to patreon.com/craftlit and pledging what you feel the show is worth to you. If you can't support the show that way, consider leaving a review at iTunes or at our facebook.com/craftlit page, or follow @craftlit on Twitter and share the show with your followers too. And remember, if your hands are too busy to pick up a book, at least you can turn one on.